How do you explain this? Enough lies. I know everything now.
The wrench slipped from my greasy fingers as my neighbor Greta Wilcox shuffled across her perfectly manicured lawn toward my driveway. At 58, she had the keen eyes of a surveillance drone and the subtlety of a freight train. I'd been under the hood of my beat-up Ford for the better part of an hour, trying to coax life back into the engine that had given up on me 3 blocks from home. "Evening, Jason," she called out, her voice carrying that sing-song quality that always preceded bad news. "I hope Laura's feeling better soon. The doctor's been making house calls almost every day this week." I straightened up, wiping my hands on an oil-stained rag. "Doctor? What doctor?" Greta's eyebrows shot up like she'd just realized she'd stepped in something unpleasant. "Oh my, I thought you knew. That handsome fellow in the BMW comes by around 2:30 most afternoons when you're at work. Very professional looking." My stomach dropped like a stone into dark water. Laura hadn't mentioned being sick. Hell, she'd been in better spirits lately than she'd been in months. Always humming in the shower, staying late at her medical practice, claiming she was swamped with patients. "Must be making house calls for convenience," I managed, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass. "You know how busy doctors get." "Oh yes, of course," Greta nodded enthusiastically. Though I did think it odd when little Janie came home from school early Tuesday and walked right in while he was there. Poor thing seemed confused when she saw his car in the driveway. The wrench in my hand suddenly felt heavy enough to anchor a ship. My 7-year-old daughter had encountered this mystery doctor in my house, while my wife was supposedly receiving medical treatment. "Well," I said, my voice steady despite the hurricane building in my chest, "I'm sure it was nothing serious. Laura would have told me if it was anything to worry about." Greta studied my face with the intensity of a crime scene investigator. "Of course she would, dear. I'm probably just being a silly old woman. You know how we neighbors like to keep an eye on things?" After she shuffled back to her house, I stood in my driveway staring at the colonial I'd spent 3 years renovating with my own hands. Every shingle, every window frame, every goddamn floorboard had been touched by these calloused fingers. I'd built this place into a home for my family, and now some smooth-handed doctor was making house calls while I was out breaking my back to pay the mortgage. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Laura's number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Her professional voice, crisp and confident. "You've reached Dr. Laura Staples. Please leave a detailed message and I'll return your call as soon as possible. Dr. Laura Staples, my wife of 15 years, mother of my 2 daughters, the woman who'd once promised to love me in sickness and in health. The woman who apparently needed medical attention I knew nothing about." The front door opened and Beth, my 13-year-old, poked her head out. "Dad, Mom wants to know if you're coming in for dinner." "Tell her I'll be right there, sweetheart." I gathered my tools and headed inside, my mind racing. The house smelled like Laura's famous pot roast, the kind she only made when she was feeling guilty about something. She stood at the kitchen sink, her auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing the blue dress I'd bought her for our anniversary last year. "How was your day?" she asked without turning around. "Interesting. Greta mentioned you've been under the weather. Said a doctor's been making house calls." Laura's shoulders tensed for just a moment before she turned with a bright smile. "Oh, that. Dr. Williams from the practice has been dropping off some files for the Henderson case. You remember Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman with the complicated insurance situation?" "Right," I said, watching her face carefully. "House calls for paperwork. Very thorough of him." "We're colleagues, Jason. Sometimes it's easier than trying to coordinate schedules at the office." She moved to the stove, stirring the pot with more vigor than necessary. "Besides, you know how crazy things have been at the practice lately?" I knew exactly how crazy things had been. Laura had been working later, taking more weekend calls and spending increasing amounts of time with her colleagues, especially Dr. Scott Williams, the golden boy of their medical group. 46 years old, married to a real estate agent, father of twin boys, and apparently very dedicated to house calls. During dinner, I watched my family with new eyes. Beth chatted about her upcoming science fair project, while Janie colored in her princess coloring book between bites of mashed potatoes. Laura smiled and nodded at all the right moments, but I caught her checking her phone 3 times during the meal. "Everything okay?" I asked when her phone buzzed for the 4th time. "Just work stuff. Mrs. Patterson's test results came back, and I need to review them tonight." After the girls went to bed, I found Laura in our home office, laptop open, fingers flying across the keyboard. The screen was angled away from me, but I caught a glimpse of what looked like a text message conversation before she quickly minimized the window. "Long day?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. "You know how it is. Medicine doesn't keep regular hours." She closed the laptop and stretched. "I'm exhausted. I think I'll head up to bed." I waited until I heard her footsteps on the stairs before I opened the laptop. It was password protected, which was new. In 15 years of marriage, Laura had never locked me out of anything. I tried her birthday, our anniversary, the girls' names. Nothing worked. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, while Laura slept peacefully beside me. Her phone sat on the nightstand, occasionally lighting up with incoming messages. Each notification felt like a small knife twisting in my gut. At 3 a.m, I slipped out of bed and went to my workshop in the garage. Hidden behind a stack of paint cans, I found the small security camera system I'd bought 6 months ago to monitor the house while we were on vacation. I'd never gotten around to installing it, but suddenly it seemed like the perfect time for a home security upgrade. The next morning, while Laura was at her Saturday morning yoga class and the girls were at their grandmother's house, I installed 3 small cameras, one in the living room with a view of the front door, one in the kitchen, and one in the hallway that captured anyone coming or going from the bedrooms. They were virtually invisible, tucked into corners and disguised as smoke detectors. By the time Laura returned home, flushed and cheerful from her workout, I was back under the hood of my truck, playing the part of the oblivious husband. "Any luck with the engine?" she asked, kissing my cheek. "Getting there. Might need to order a new alternator." "Well, don't work too hard. I was thinking we could take the girls to that new restaurant tonight." "Sounds perfect," I said, meaning it. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe Greta had misunderstood what she'd seen. Maybe Dr. Williams really was just dropping off paperwork. But as Laura walked back into the house, I noticed she was checking her phone again, and her yoga mat looked suspiciously dry for someone who just spent an hour in a heated studio. Monday morning arrived with the subtle promise of answers. I kissed Laura goodbye as she left for the practice, then drove the girls to school before heading to my current job site. But instead of losing myself in the familiar rhythm of hammer and nails, I found myself checking my phone every few minutes, waiting for the motion alerts from my newly installed security system. At 2:47 p.m., my phone buzzed. Motion detected in the living room. My hands shook as I opened the app and watched a silver BMW pull into my driveway. A tall man in a dark suit emerged from the driver's seat, straightened his tie, and walked to my front door with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Dr. Scott Williams. I recognized him from the practice's website and the few social gatherings Laura had dragged me to over the years. Handsome in that effortless way that came from good genetics and expensive grooming. The kind of man who'd never had grease under his fingernails or worried about making a mortgage payment. The front door opened before he could knock. Laura appeared in the frame, and even through the grainy camera footage, I could see her face light up in a way it hadn't for me in years. She was wearing the red dress I'd never seen before, the one that hugged her figure and made her look 10 years younger. They disappeared from view, moving deeper into the house. I switched to the kitchen camera and watched them talking in hushed, intimate tones. Laura poured 2 glasses of wine from the bottle we'd been saving for our anniversary. Williams leaned against the counter with casual familiarity, like he'd done this 100 times before. At 3:15, they moved toward the hallway. The camera caught them walking hand in hand toward our bedroom. My bedroom. The room where I'd held my newborn daughters, where I'd comforted Laura through her mother's end, where we'd made love on lazy Sunday mornings when the world was still full of possibilities. I closed the app and sat in my truck, staring at the half-framed house in front of me. My crew was waiting for instructions, but I couldn't form words. The betrayal felt like a physical weight crushing my chest, making it hard to breathe. At 4:30, another motion alert. I watched Williams emerge from the house, adjusting his suit jacket and checking his watch. Laura followed him to the door, straightening her dress and running her fingers through her disheveled hair. They kissed goodbye like lovers who'd been together for years, not colleagues discussing patient files. The BMW disappeared down the street just as the school bus rounded the corner, bringing my daughters home to a house that would never feel the same again. That evening, I sat across from Laura at the dinner table, watching her smile and laugh with our daughters as if she hadn't spent the afternoon in bed with another man. The pot roast tasted like sawdust, and every casual comment about her day felt like another lie piling onto an already crushing weight. "How was work today?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. Busy as always. We had that quarterly review meeting that ran way too long. She didn't even blink as the lie rolled off her tongue. Dr. Williams presented the Henderson case findings very thorough. I'm sure he was. After dinner, I helped Beth with her algebra homework while Laura gave Janie a bath. Normal family activities that now felt like an elaborate performance. When both girls were finally asleep, I found Laura in the living room curled up on the couch with a medical journal. I need to run to the hardware store, I said. We're out of wood screws for the Morrison job. At 9 o'clock at night? They're open until 10. I want to get an early start tomorrow. She nodded without looking up from her journal. Drive safely. Instead of the hardware store, I drove to Mike's boxing gym on the south side of town. Mike Torino had been my best friend since high school, back when we were both stupid enough to think we could make money getting punched in the face. Now he ran a gym that attracted everyone from suburban housewives looking to lose weight to ex-cons trying to stay out of trouble. I found him in his office, a cramped room above the gym floor that smelled like sweat and old leather. He looked up from a stack of invoices when I knocked. Jay, what brings you here this late? Need to hit something, I said. Hard. Mike studied my face with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of men at their breaking point. Grab some gloves, I'll hold the heavy bag. For 30 minutes, I pounded the bag with everything I had. Each punch was fueled by the image of Williams walking into my house, of Laura's face lighting up when she saw him, of their hands intertwined as they walked toward my bedroom. By the time I was finished, my knuckles were raw and my shirt was soaked with sweat. Feel better? Mike asked. Not even close. He tossed me a towel and sat on a nearby bench. You want to talk about it? I told him everything. The neighbors' observations, the security cameras, the afternoon rendezvous. Mike listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail. Jesus, Jay, I'm sorry. What would you do? I asked. Mike was quiet for a long moment. 15 years ago, I would have knocked the crap out of both of them and ended up in jail. But I'm older now and marginally wiser. He leaned forward. You want my advice? Document everything, get a lawyer, protect your kids and your assets. That's the rational approach. But you're not feeling particularly rational right now, not even close. Then be smart about it. If you're going to make them pay, do it right. Make it hurt, but don't give them anything they can use against you in court. I drove home with Mike's words echoing in my head. Laura was already asleep when I slipped into bed, or at least pretending to be. I lay awake until dawn, planning. The next few days fell into a routine of surveillance and documentation. Every afternoon at 2:47, Williams's BMW would appear in my driveway. Every afternoon, I would watch through the security cameras as my wife welcomed her lover into our home. They had developed a comfortable pattern, wine in the kitchen, conversation that grew more intimate by the minute, then the walk to the bedroom that lasted anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half. On Thursday, something changed. At 3:20, while Williams and Laura were in the bedroom, the front door opened and Janie walked in. She'd been dismissed early from school for a teacher development day, something Laura had apparently forgotten. I watched through the kitchen camera as my 7-year-old daughter looked around the empty room, confused by the 2 wine glasses and the man's jacket draped over a chair. She called out for her mother, her small voice echoing through the house. Williams appeared in the hallway 30 seconds later, fully dressed but disheveled, panic written across his face. Laura emerged behind him, clutching a bathrobe and looking terrified. They had a hurried, whispered conversation while Janie waited in the kitchen, still calling for her mother. Williams grabbed his jacket and bolted for the front door without another word. Laura composed herself and went to greet our daughter as if nothing had happened. But I could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands shook as she poured Janie a glass of milk and asked about her day. That night, Laura was quieter than usual at dinner. She kept glancing at Janie as if expecting our daughter to ask uncomfortable questions. But Janie was 7 years old and easily distracted by talk of her upcoming dance recital. Everything okay? I asked Laura as we cleaned up the dishes. Of course. Why wouldn't it be? You seem tense. Just tired. It's been a long week. I nodded sympathetically while rage burned in my chest. Not only was she betraying our marriage, but she was doing it in our home while our children could walk in at any moment. The carelessness of it, the complete disregard for our daughter's well-being, pushed me past the point of rational thought. Friday morning, I called in sick to work and drove to Williams's medical practice. The building was a modern glass structure in the professional district, the kind of place that screamed success and respectability. I sat in my truck across the street, watching well-dressed patients come and go, wondering how many of them knew they were being treated by a man who made house calls to other men's wives. At 11:30, Williams emerged from the building and walked to his BMW. Even from a distance, I could see the confidence in his stride, the way he carried himself like a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. He was handsome in that polished way that came from expensive haircuts and tailored suits, the kind of man who probably hadn't thrown a punch or taken one since middle school. I followed him to an upscale restaurant downtown where he met another man for lunch. They sat at a table by the window, laughing and shaking hands over what looked like a business deal. Williams checked his phone several times during the meal, probably texting my wife. After lunch, he returned to the practice. I waited until 5:30, then followed him to an expensive neighborhood on the north side of town. His house was a sprawling colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn and a circular driveway. A woman emerged to greet him at the front door, his wife, I assumed. She was blonde and attractive in a suburban soccer mom way, probably had no idea her husband was spending his afternoons in other women's bedrooms. Two boys, maybe 10 or 11 years old, ran out to hug their father. Williams lifted them both, spinning them around while they laughed. The picture of domestic bliss, just like the one he was helping to destroy at my house. I drove home with a plan forming in my mind. Mike was right about being smart, but he was wrong about one thing. Sometimes rational approaches weren't enough. Sometimes you had to fight fire with fire. That weekend, I told Laura I was going fishing with Mike. Instead, I drove to an electronics store in the next town over and bought a small digital recorder and a GPS tracking device. Both purchases were made with cash, no paper trail. Sunday night, while Laura was giving the girls their baths, I slipped out to the garage and attached the GPS tracker to the undercarriage of her car. The device was magnetic and virtually undetectable, designed for concerned parents to monitor teenage drivers, but it would work just as well for monitoring cheating wives. Monday morning arrived with the familiar routine. Laura left for work at 7:30, the girls caught their bus at 8:15, and I headed to the job site with a new sense of purpose. At 2:30, I checked the GPS tracker on my phone. Laura's car was parked at a motel on the outskirts of town, a seedy place called the Pines that rented rooms by the hour and didn't ask questions. They'd moved their operation off-site. Probably spooked by Janie's unexpected arrival, they'd decided my house was too risky. The motel was a smart choice from their perspective, anonymous, discreet, and far enough from the medical district that they were unlikely to run into colleagues or patients. But it was also a tactical error. At home, they had the illusion of respectability, the cover story of professional consultations. At the Pines Motel, there was no hiding what they were really doing. I drove to the motel and parked across the street behind an abandoned gas station. Through binoculars, I could see Williams's BMW parked outside room 237. The curtains were drawn, but I didn't need to see inside to know what was happening. They emerged 2 hours later, Williams first, then Laura 5 minutes behind him. Even from a distance, I could see the satisfied expressions on their faces, the casual closeness of two people who'd just spent the afternoon exploring each other's bodies. Williams drove away without looking back. Laura sat in her car for several minutes, checking her appearance in the rearview mirror and reapplying lipstick. Then she drove to a coffee shop near the girls' school, establishing her alibi for the afternoon. That evening, she came home with coffee on her breath and a story about meeting with a pharmaceutical representative who'd kept her waiting for 2 hours. Another lie, delivered with the same casual confidence as all the others. "How was your day?" she asked, kissing my cheek. "Productive," I said. "Very productive." Tuesday morning, I made my first move. While Laura was in the shower, I used her laptop to print out bank statements and credit card bills from the past 6 months. The password protection had been easy enough to bypass. She'd written it on a sticky note hidden under her desk blotter. For a smart woman, she was remarkably careless about operational security. The financial records told an interesting story. Lunch charges at expensive restaurants on days when she'd claimed to be too busy to eat. Hotel charges in the next town over during a weekend when she'd supposedly been at a medical conference. Purchases at Victoria's secret and expensive lingerie boutiques, none of which had made their way into our bedroom. But the most damning evidence was a charge for $200 at a jewelry store downtown, dated just 2 weeks ago. Laura hadn't given me any jewelry recently, and her birthday wasn't for another 3 months. Someone was receiving gifts, but it wasn't her husband. I photographed everything with my phone, then carefully returned the papers to her desk. When Laura emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel and humming softly, I was sitting on the bed tying my work boots. "You're up early," she said. "Big day ahead. The Morrison job is behind schedule." She nodded and moved to her closet, selecting a dress I'd never seen before. Black, form-fitting, expensive-looking, not the kind of thing she typically wore to examine patients. "Will you be home for dinner?" she asked. "Should be, unless something comes up." Something always seems to come up lately. I looked at her carefully. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, just an observation. She applied lipstick in the mirror, avoiding my eyes. "You've been working a lot of late nights recently." The irony was breathtaking. She was actually trying to make me feel guilty for working while she spent her afternoons in motel rooms with another man. "Bills don't pay themselves," I said. "I know, I just miss spending time together." I stood and walked to the door, then turned back. "Maybe we should plan something special, a romantic weekend getaway, just the two of us." Her face went pale. "That sounds wonderful, but you know how busy things are at the practice right now. I'm sure Dr. Williams could cover for you." She fumbled with her lipstick, nearly dropping it. "What made you mention Scott specifically?" "Just a thought. He seems like the dedicated type." Laura's hands were visibly shaking now. "Yes, he's very dedicated." I left for work with a grim satisfaction. The first crack had appeared in her composure. Now it was time to apply more pressure. At lunch, I drove to the Pines Motel and had a conversation with the desk clerk, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who'd clearly seen everything and been surprised by none of it. "I'm looking for information about my wife," I said, sliding a $50 bill across the counter along with a photo of Laura. "She's been meeting someone here." The woman studied the photo, then looked at me with something approaching sympathy. "Room 237. Usually checks in around 3, stays for 2 hours, pays cash." "How long has this been going on?" "Couple months, maybe longer. She's always with the same guy, tall, good-looking, drives a fancy car." I slid another 50 across the counter. "I need to get into that room today after they leave." "I can't let you do that, honey. It's against policy." "What if I told you I was her husband and I suspected she was conducting illegal pill transactions?" The woman considered this. "In that case, I might accidentally leave my master key on the counter while I go to the bathroom, but you didn't hear it from me." At 2:45, I watched from my hiding spot as Williams and Laura arrived separately and entered room 237. At 4:30, they emerged and left in their respective vehicles. 5 minutes later, I was inside the room with the master key. The place was exactly what I'd expected. Cheap furniture, thin walls, and the lingering smell of industrial disinfectant trying to mask more unpleasant odors. But it was clean enough for what they needed, and anonymous enough to provide the illusion of safety. I planted the digital recorder under the nightstand and left without touching anything else. Tomorrow's recording session would provide all the evidence I needed for the next phase of my plan. That evening, Laura was unusually affectionate. She cooked my favorite meal, opened a bottle of wine, and spent dinner asking about my work and my plans for the weekend. It might have been guilt, or it might have been overcompensation, but it felt like a performance either way. "You seem different lately," she said as we cleaned up the dishes. "Different how?" "I don't know, more attentive, more present," she smiled. "I like it." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. She was praising me for paying attention while she was cheating on me with another man. But instead, I played along. "Maybe I've been taking you for granted," I said. "Maybe it's time I started appreciating what I have." She kissed me then, soft and sweet, the way she used to when we were young and still believed in forever. For a moment, I almost forgot about the cameras and the motel room and the lies. For a moment, she was just Laura, the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But then her phone buzzed with a text message, and I saw her eyes flick toward it with automatic anticipation. The spell was broken. Wednesday brought rain and the promise of answers. I spent the morning at the job site, going through the motions of supervising my crew while my mind was elsewhere. At 2:30, I checked the GPS tracker. Laura's car was at the motel again, right on schedule. At 5 o'clock, I returned to room 237 and retrieved the digital recorder. The desk clerk pretended not to see me, but I left another 50 on the counter anyway. Loyalty was a commodity like any other, and I could afford to pay for it. I didn't listen to the recording until after dinner, when Laura was helping Beth with her science project and Janie was watching cartoons in the living room. I went to my workshop in the garage, closed the door, and plugged in a pair of headphones. What I heard was worse than I'd imagined. Not just the sounds of physical closeness, but the casual cruelty of their conversation afterward. Laura complaining about me, about our marriage, about how I'd let myself go and become boring. Williams laughing and agreeing, making jokes about blue-collar workers and their limited horizons. But the part that destroyed me was when Laura said, "I can't wait until this is all over, until I can finally be free of him and start my real life." Williams responded, "Just be patient, baby. Once the divorce is final and you get your settlement, we can be together openly. It'll be worth the wait." They were planning my destruction with the casual efficiency of a business transaction. Laura wasn't just cheating. She was strategically positioning herself for a divorce that would leave me financially ruined and separated from my daughters. I sat in my workshop for an hour after the recording ended, staring at the tools I'd used to build our home, thinking about the life I'd thought we were building together. Everything had been a lie. Every smile, every kiss, every "I love you" had been part of an elaborate performance designed to keep me compliant until she was ready to pull the trigger. But Laura had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated me. I spent the rest of the evening researching divorce law and asset protection strategies. If she wanted a war, I'd give her one. But it would be fought on my terms, with weapons she didn't even know I possessed. Thursday morning, I called Mike and asked him to meet me for lunch. We sat in a booth at Denny's, away from other customers, and I played him selected portions of the recording. His face grew darker with each revelation. When it was over, he leaned back and shook his head. "Jesus Christ, Jay, this is brutal." "It gets worse. They're planning to take me to the cleaners in the divorce. Laura's been documenting every penny I spend, every late night at work, building a case that I'm an absent father and unreliable provider. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to win them at their own game, but I need help." Mike owned a small towing company in addition to the gym, which meant he had connections throughout the city's service industry. Mechanics, locksmiths, security guards, bartenders, people who saw everything and were often invisible to those they served. "What kind of help?" he asked. "The kind that leaves no fingerprints." Mike studied my face for a long moment. "You sure about this? Once you start down this road, there's no going back." "They already started down this road. I'm just catching up." That afternoon, while Laura was at her motel rendezvous, I implemented phase 1 of my counter strategy. Using information Mike had provided, I visited 3 key locations: Williams' medical practice, his favorite lunch restaurant, and the parking garage where he kept his BMW during evening social events. At each location, I had brief conversations with people who worked behind the scenes: a security guard who'd noticed Williams' afternoon absences, a waitress who'd seen him dining with women who weren't his wife, a parking attendant who'd witnessed heated phone conversations in expensive cars. I didn't ask them to do anything illegal or unethical. I simply made sure they knew who I was, gave them my business card, and mentioned that I might need character witnesses in an upcoming legal proceeding. People in service industries understood the value of loyalty, especially when it came with the promise of future compensation. By the end of the day, I had a network of potential allies positioned throughout Williams's daily routine. They would watch, listen, and remember, and when the time came, they would testify about what they'd observed. That evening, Laura came home with another story about pharmaceutical representatives and scheduling conflicts. She seemed more relaxed than she'd been in days, probably because she thought her secret was still safe. "How was your day?" she asked. "Educational," I said. "Very educational." After the girls went to bed, I found Laura in the living room reading a medical journal. She looked up when I entered and smiled. "Want to watch something together? It feels like we haven't done that in forever." I sat beside her on the couch, the same couch where she'd probably planned her betrayal, and put my arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me with a contented sigh. "This is nice," she murmured. "It is," I agreed. "We should do it more often." "Maybe we should plan that romantic getaway you mentioned. I could probably clear my schedule for a long weekend." I looked down at her, this woman who'd shared my bed for 15 years, who'd given birth to my children, who was now planning to destroy my life for another man. "That sounds perfect," I said. "I'll start making arrangements." She smiled and squeezed my hand. "I love you, Jason." "I love you too," I replied, meaning it in a way she could never understand. I loved the woman she used to be, the woman I'd thought she still was, But that woman was gone, replaced by a stranger who wore her face and spoke with her voice. The war had begun, but Laura didn't know it yet. She was still playing by the old rules, the ones that assumed I was too trusting and too stupid to see what was happening in my own life. She was about to learn how wrong she'd been. Friday morning brought an unexpected opportunity. Laura announced over breakfast that she would be working late, covering for a colleague who'd called in sick. It was a lie, of course. I'd already checked the GPS tracker and knew she was planning another afternoon at the Pines Motel. But it gave me the perfect excuse to implement the next phase of my plan. "That's too bad," I said, buttering my toast with practiced nonchalance. "I was hoping we could spend some time together tonight." "Rain check," she said, kissing my forehead. "This weekend, I promise." After she left for work and the girls caught their bus, I made a series of phone calls. The first was to my lawyer, Tom Bradley, a sharp-eyed man in his 60s who'd handled the legal work when I started my construction business. "Tom, I need to discuss a sensitive matter. Can you see me today?" "How sensitive are we talking, Jason?" "Divorce sensitive with complications." There was a pause. "Come in at 10 and bring whatever documentation you have." The second call was to my accountant, a meticulous woman named Patricia who'd been handling my books for 5 years. I scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon to discuss asset protection strategies. The third call was to Mike. "It's time to expand the network," I told him. "I need eyes and ears in places where Williams and Laura feel safe." "What did you have in mind?" "Laura's been getting her hair done at that expensive salon downtown, the one where all the doctors' wives go to gossip. I'm betting the stylists hear everything." "I know someone who works there, Carla Martinez. She's been cutting hair for 20 years and has 3 kids to support. She might be willing to listen for the right price." Set up a meeting. By noon, I had appointments scheduled with my lawyer, my accountant, and Carla Martinez. I also had a plan that would either save my marriage or end it on my terms. The meeting with Tom Bradley was enlightening and depressing in equal measure. He listened to the recording from the motel room, reviewed the financial documents I'd gathered, and shook his head grimly. "She's been planning this for months, maybe longer," he said. "The paper trail suggests she's been positioning assets and documenting your behavior to support a case for primary custody and significant alimony. What are my options? Legally, you file first, which gives you some tactical advantages. You present evidence of her infidelity, which affects asset division in this state. You document her deception and manipulation, which impacts custody arrangements. And illegally," Tom raised an eyebrow. "I didn't hear that question, and you didn't ask it." "Hypothetically, then." "Hypothetically, the best revenge is living well. Hypothetically, destroying someone's reputation and professional standing is more effective than physical violence. Hypothetically, the court of public opinion can be harsher than any legal judgment." I left Tom's office with a clear understanding of my legal position and a growing appreciation for the power of strategic information warfare. The meeting with Patricia was equally productive. She outlined several methods for protecting my business assets and ensuring that Laura couldn't claim ownership of property I had acquired before our marriage. She also identified several financial vulnerabilities that Laura had created through her careless spending on her affair. "The good news is that your business is structured as a sole proprietorship with clear documentation of premarital assets," Patricia explained. "The bad news is that she's been using joint credit cards to fund her extracurricular activities, which makes you legally responsible for those debts." "How much are we talking about?" "Based on these statements, about $15,000 in the past 6 months. Hotels, restaurants, gifts, lingerie. She's been living like a single woman on a married woman's budget." The meeting with Carla Martinez took place at a coffee shop near her salon. She was a small, fierce woman with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that spoke of long hours and hard work. "Mike says you need information about someone who comes to our salon," she said without preamble. "Dr. Laura Staples. Auburn hair, usually comes in on Thursday afternoons." Carla nodded. "I know her. Talks a lot when she's in the chair, always bragging about her new boyfriend, how much better he is than her husband." My stomach clenched, but I kept my expression neutral. "What kind of things does she say?" "Last week she was showing off some expensive earrings he bought her. Said her husband was too cheap and boring to buy her nice things. She also mentioned something about a divorce lawyer." "She's consulted a divorce attorney?" "That's what she said. Some hotshot downtown who specializes in taking men to the cleaners." Carla leaned forward. "Look, I don't usually get involved in other people's business, but I've got a son about your age. If some woman was planning to destroy his life, I'd want him to know about it." I slid an envelope across the table. "There's $500 in there, with another $500 if you can find out the name of her attorney." Carla pocketed the envelope without looking inside. "I'll see what I can do." That afternoon, while Laura was at the motel with Williams, I drove to Beth's school for her parent-teacher conference. It was something Laura usually handled, but I'd volunteered to take this one, claiming a rare break in my work schedule. Mrs. Henderson, Beth's 7th-grade teacher, was a kind woman in her 50s who'd been teaching for 30 years. She spoke glowingly about Beth's academic performance and her maturity, but I detected a note of concern in her voice. "Is everything okay at home?" she asked. "Beth seems a little distracted lately, more anxious than usual." "What kind of anxiety?" "She's been asking a lot of questions about divorce, whether kids get to choose which parent they live with, what happens to families when parents split up. I wondered if she'd been exposed to something that might have triggered these concerns." My heart sank. Beth was 13, old enough to pick up on tension between her parents, old enough to worry about what it might mean for her future. "We've been going through a rough patch," I admitted. I didn't realize she'd noticed. "Kids notice everything, Mr. Fairburn. They just don't always know how to process what they're seeing." I drove home with a new sense of urgency. This wasn't just about Laura and me anymore. Our daughters were already being affected by the destruction of our marriage, even though they didn't fully understand what was happening. That evening, Laura came home with another elaborate excuse about her late night at the office. She seemed tired and distracted, probably from her afternoon activities rather than any medical emergencies. "How was the parent-teacher conference?" she asked. "Fine. Mrs. Henderson says Beth is doing well academically." "That's good. I was worried about her science grades." I watched her face carefully. "She did mention that Beth seems anxious lately, asking questions about divorce." Laura went very still. "Divorce? Why would she be thinking about that? Kids pick up on things. Maybe she's sensing some tension between us." "What kind of tension?" Laura's voice was carefully controlled, but I could see the panic in her eyes. "The usual stuff, work stress, financial pressure, the normal challenges of a long marriage." I shrugged. "Nothing we can't work through." Laura relaxed slightly. "Of course, every marriage goes through difficult periods." "Exactly. The important thing is that we're committed to making it work." She smiled and kissed my cheek. "I'm glad you feel that way." Later that night, after Laura had fallen asleep, I sat in my workshop reviewing everything I'd learned. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, recordings, witness testimony, and now confirmation that she'd already consulted a divorce attorney. Laura wasn't just cheating, she was systematically preparing to destroy my life. But she'd made several crucial mistakes. She'd underestimated my intelligence, overestimated her own cleverness, and most importantly, she'd forgotten that I knew her better than anyone else in the world. I understood her weaknesses, her insecurities, and her fears. The next phase of my plan would exploit all of them. Saturday morning, I told Laura I was going to spend the day working on the Morrison job. Instead, I drove to William's neighborhood and parked across the street from his house. At 10:30, he emerged with his wife and twin boys, all dressed in matching soccer uniforms. They loaded into a minivan and drove to the local sports complex. I followed at a distance and watched Williams play the role of devoted father, cheering from the sidelines as his sons ran up and down the soccer field. His wife sat beside him, occasionally leaning over to whisper something that made him laugh. They looked like the perfect American family, the kind featured in insurance commercials and suburban lifestyle magazines. But I knew what Williams did on weekday afternoons, when his family thought he was saving lives and healing the sick. I knew about the motel rooms and the lies and the casual cruelty of his conversations with my wife. During halftime, Williams walked to the concession stand to buy drinks for his family. I intercepted him near the restroom facilities, away from other parents and children. "Dr. Williams," I said, stepping into his path. He looked confused for a moment, then recognition dawned. "Jason, right? Laura's husband. What a surprise to see you here." "I'm sure it is." I kept my voice friendly, conversational. "How's your practice going? I hear you've been making a lot of house calls lately." Williams's face went pale. "I'm sorry?" "House calls, personal consultations with patients who can't make it to the office. Very dedicated of you." "I think there might be some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding at all. In fact, I have it on good authority that you're one of the most dedicated doctors in the city, always willing to go the extra mile for your patients." Williams glanced nervously toward the soccer field. where his wife was watching their sons play. "Look, Jason, I think we should have a conversation?" "Absolutely. But not here, not in front of your family. They look so happy, so trusting. It would be a shame to ruin their day with unpleasant business." I pulled out a business card and pressed it into his hand. "Call me Monday morning. We have a lot to discuss." I walked away without looking back, leaving William standing by the restrooms with my business card in his trembling hand and the weight of his secrets crushing down on his shoulders. The game ended with his son's team winning 3-2, but Williams barely seemed to notice. He went through the motions of congratulating the players and chatting with other parents, but I could see the fear in his eyes from across the parking lot. As they loaded back into their minivan, Williams's wife asked him something that made him shake his head and force a smile. He was already lying to her, already beginning the process of deception that would ultimately destroy his perfect family life. I drove home with a sense of satisfaction. The first shot had been fired, and Williams knew he was in my crosshairs. Now it was time to turn my attention to Laura and the network of lies she'd built around our marriage. The war was escalating, and I intended to win. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth and the promise of decisive action. Williams called at exactly 9:15 a.m., his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We need to meet," he said without preamble. "I was hoping you'd say that. Riverside Park, by the old boat launch. 1 hour. Jason, I want you to know that whatever you think is happening, save it for our face-to-face conversation, Doctor. 1 hour." I arrived at the park 30 minutes early and positioned myself at a picnic table with a clear view of all approaches. The location was public enough to prevent any accusations of threatening behavior, but isolated enough for a frank discussion without interruption. Williams arrived precisely on time, driving his BMW with the careful attention of a man who couldn't afford any additional complications in his life. He looked haggard, like he'd spent the weekend wrestling with his conscience and losing. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, sitting across from me at the picnic table. "Thank you for calling. It shows you're smarter than I gave you credit for." Williams fidgeted with his car keys, avoiding eye contact. "I want you to know that I never intended for things to go this far." "What things would those be, exactly?" "My relationship with Laura. It started innocently, just professional collaboration, but then..." He trailed off, apparently realizing that any explanation would only make things worse. I pulled out my phone and played a brief excerpt from the motel room recording. William's voice, clear and unmistakable, making jokes about blue-collar workers and their limited horizons. Williams went white as a sheet. "Where did you get that?" "Does it matter? The question is, what are we going to do about it?" "What do you want?" "I want you to understand the situation you've created. You're not just having an affair with my wife. You're actively participating in a plan to destroy my life and separate me from my children." Williams shook his head frantically. "That's not true. Laura never said anything about..." I played another excerpt from the recording, Laura's voice discussing divorce strategy and asset division with clinical detachment. "Jesus Christ," Williams whispered. "She's been planning this for months, maybe longer, using you as both emotional support and financial leverage. Did you really think she was going to leave her comfortable life for a relationship built on lies and betrayal?" Williams buried his face in his hands. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to end it. Today, no contact, no explanation, no dramatic goodbye scene, just disappear from her life completely." "And if I don't?" I leaned forward, making sure he could see the cold certainty in my eyes. "Then I destroy you. I send copies of these recordings to your wife, your colleagues, the medical board, and anyone else who might find them interesting. I make sure everyone in this city knows exactly what kind of man you really are." Williams was quiet for a long moment, staring at the water lapping against the boat launch. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. It's not that simple. Laura, she's not going to just let this go." "What do you mean?" "She's obsessive, controlling. When she wants something, she doesn't stop until she gets it. If I try to end things, she'll make my life hell." I almost laughed at the irony. Williams was afraid of Laura, the same woman who'd been systematically betraying me for months. "That's your problem to solve, Doctor. But solve it you will, because the alternative is much worse than anything Laura might do to you." Williams nodded slowly. "How do I know you won't release those recordings anyway?" "You don't. But I'm a reasonable man, and I believe in proportional response. End the affair, stay away from my wife, and we never have to see each other again. And if Laura contacts me, then you tell her the truth, that her husband knows everything and you're not willing to risk your career and family for a relationship that was doomed from the start." Williams stood up on unsteady legs. This is going to destroy her. She destroyed herself the moment she chose betrayal over honesty. I'm just making sure the consequences catch up with her. Williams walked back to his BMW like a man heading to his own execution. I watched him drive away, then sat by the water for another hour, planning my next moves. That afternoon, while Laura was presumably wondering why Williams hadn't shown up for their scheduled rendezvous, I received a call from Carla Martinez. "I got that information you wanted," she said. "Your wife's lawyer is Rebecca Morrison, downtown firm specializing in high-asset divorces. Word is she's ruthless and expensive." "How expensive?" $500 an hour, with a $50,000 retainer. Your wife paid it last month with a cashier's check. The news hit me like a physical blow. Laura had already paid $50,000 to a divorce attorney, money that had come from our joint savings account. She wasn't just planning to leave me. She was already well into the legal process. "There's more," Carla continued. "She was in the salon this morning, crying and carrying on about some man who'd broken her heart. Wouldn't give details, but she kept saying he was a coward and she'd trusted him with everything." Williams had followed through on his promise to end the affair. Laura was discovering that her carefully constructed plan was falling apart. "Thanks, Carla. There's a bonus in this for you." That evening, Laura came home 2 hours late with red-rimmed eyes and a story about a difficult patient who died despite her best efforts. It was a lie, of course, but delivered with such genuine emotion that I almost felt sorry for her. "Rough day?" I asked. "The worst. Sometimes I wonder why I became a doctor if I can't save the people who need it most." She was talking about Williams, not any patient. Her lover had abandoned her, and she was processing the betrayal in the only way she knew how, by creating an elaborate fiction that cast her as the sufferer. "Want to talk about it?" "Not really. I just want to take a bath and go to bed." I watched her climb the stairs with slumped shoulders and defeated posture. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to hold her while she cried and tell her everything would be okay. But that impulse was overwhelmed by the memory of her voice on the recording, casually discussing my destruction like a business transaction. Tuesday brought confirmation that Williams was keeping his word. The GPS tracker showed Laura driving to the Pines Motel, waiting in the parking lot for 30 minutes, then driving to a bar across town where she spent 2 hours drinking alone. Wednesday, she drove to Williams' medical practice and sat in the parking lot for an hour, probably hoping to catch a glimpse of him. When that failed, she went to their usual restaurant and waited at a table for two until the staff asked her to leave. By Thursday, Laura's behavior had become erratic and desperate. She called in sick to work, spent the morning driving aimlessly around the city, and ended up at a shopping mall where she bought $300 worth of lingerie that would never be seen by its intended recipient. Thursday evening, she finally cracked. "Jason, I need to tell you something," she said as we cleaned up after dinner. My heart raced, but I kept my expression neutral. "What's on your mind?" "I've been unhappy, in our marriage, I mean, for a long time." "Unhappy how?" She took a deep breath. "I feel like we've grown apart, like we want different things from life." "What kind of things?" "I don't know, everything. The way we spend our time, the way we communicate, the way we—" She gestured vaguely. "The way we connect as a couple." I nodded thoughtfully, as if this was the first time I'd considered the possibility that our marriage was in trouble. "Have you thought about counseling?" I asked. Laura's face fell. This wasn't the response she'd been expecting. "Counseling? If we're having communication problems, maybe a professional could help us work through them." I don't think counseling would help at this point." "Why not?" "Because some problems can't be fixed, Jason. Some differences are too fundamental to overcome." I could see her struggling to find the words that would justify her betrayal without actually confessing to it. She wanted to leave me, but she also wanted to maintain the moral high ground. "Are you saying you want a divorce?" I asked quietly. The word hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. Laura's eyes filled with tears, but I could see relief in her expression. "I think it might be for the best," she whispered. "For both of us." "What about the girls?" "They'll adjust. Children are more resilient than we think." "And you've thought this through? The financial implications, the custody arrangements, all of it?" Laura nodded. "I've done some preliminary research." Preliminary research was an interesting way to describe $50,000 paid to a divorce attorney, but I let it slide. "Well," I said finally, "if that's what you really want, I won't fight you on it." Laura looked stunned. "You won't?" I want you to be happy, Laura. If you think you'd be happier without me, then maybe we should explore that option. She started crying then, huge sobs that shook her entire body. I put my arms around her and held her while she wept, knowing that her tears weren't for our marriage or our family, but for the lover who'd abandoned her and the plan that had fallen apart. "I'm sorry," she whispered against my chest. "I'm so sorry." "I know," I said, stroking her hair. "I know you are." But sorry wasn't enough. Not anymore. Friday morning, I called Tom Bradley and told him to begin divorce proceedings immediately. "Are you sure about this, Jason? Once we file, there's no going back." "I'm sure. But I want to do this right. I want full custody of the girls, and I want her to pay for what she's done. The infidelity evidence will help, but we need to be strategic about how we present it. I have more than infidelity evidence. I have financial records showing she's been funding her affair with marital assets. I have recordings of her discussing divorce strategy with her lover. I have witness testimony about her behavior and her plans." Tom was quiet for a moment. "Jesus, Jason. How long have you been building this case?" "Long enough. Can you win? With evidence like that? I can destroy her." "Then do it." That afternoon, while Laura was at work trying to pretend her life wasn't falling apart, I sat down with Beth and Janie to have the most difficult conversation of my life. "Girls, your mother and I need to talk to you about something important." Beth looked up from her homework with worried eyes. "Are you getting divorced?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. "What makes you ask that?" "I heard you and Mom talking last night, and she's been crying a lot lately." Janie looked back and forth between us, not fully understanding the conversation, but sensing its importance. "Yes," I said finally. "We probably are going to get divorced." Beth nodded like she'd been expecting this news. "Will we have to choose who to live with?" "I don't know yet, sweetheart. But whatever happens, both your mother and I love you very much, and that will never change." "Is it because of the doctor who comes to visit?" Janie asked innocently. Beth and I both stared at her. "What doctor, honey?" "The one who makes Mommy happy. He comes over sometimes when you're at work." My heart broke a little more. Even my 7-year-old daughter had noticed what I'd been too trusting to see. "That's complicated, Janie. But it's not your fault, okay? None of this is your fault." That evening, Laura came home to find divorce papers waiting on the kitchen table. She stood in the doorway staring at them for a full minute before looking up at me. "You filed already? You said you wanted a divorce. I'm giving you what you want. I thought we'd discuss it more, maybe try counseling first." "You said counseling wouldn't help." Laura picked up the papers with shaking hands. As she read through the custody demands and asset division proposals, her face went from pale to furious. "This is ridiculous, Jason. You're asking for full custody and trying to claim the house as separate property." "The house was purchased with money from my business, which I owned before we got married. And as for custody, I think the girls would be better off with the parent who hasn't been lying to them for months." "What's that supposed to mean?" I pulled out my phone and played the motel room recording. Laura's voice filled the kitchen, discussing our divorce and her plans for our daughters with clinical detachment. Laura sank into a chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight. "Where did you get this?" "Does it matter? The question is, how do you think a judge will react when he hears you discussing our children like assets to be divided? You can't use this in court. It was recorded without my consent. Actually, in this state, I only need one party's consent to record a conversation. And since Williams was a willing participant, the recording is perfectly legal." Laura's face crumpled. "You've destroyed everything." "I didn't destroy anything, Laura. I just documented the destruction you'd already caused." She looked up at me, with hatred in her eyes. "You think you've won, but this isn't over. I'll fight you for every penny, every minute with the girls. Go ahead. But remember, I have recordings of you and Williams discussing how to manipulate the custody evaluation. I have financial records showing you've been stealing from our joint accounts to fund your affair. I have witnesses who will testify about your behavior and your plans." Laura stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair. "I need to call my lawyer. Rebecca Morrison? Good choice. Expensive, but effective. Of course, she'll need another retainer now that Williams isn't helping with your legal fees." Laura froze. "How do you—" "I know everything, Laura. Every lie, every secret, every plan you've made to destroy our family. The only question now is how much more damage you want to cause before you accept the inevitable." She ran upstairs without another word, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the divorce papers and the wreckage of our marriage. But for the first time in months, I felt something approaching peace. The war was almost over, and I was going to win. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of legal maneuvering and emotional devastation. Laura hired a second attorney to work alongside Rebecca Morrison, burning through money we didn't have in a desperate attempt to salvage her position. But every move she made only strengthened my case. She tried to claim I'd been abusive, but the recordings proved she'd never mentioned any misuse to Williams, even in their most intimate conversations. She tried to argue that I was an absent father, but Beth and Janie's school records showed I'd attended more parent-teacher conferences and school events than she had. Most damaging of all, she tried to paint herself as the sufferer of a loveless marriage, only to have her own words played back to her in deposition. The recording of her laughing about my limited horizons and discussing her plans to finally be free destroyed any sympathy she might have garnered. Williams, meanwhile, had completely disappeared from the picture. His wife had filed for divorce after learning about the affair, and he'd taken a leave of absence from his medical practice to deal with the fallout. The medical board was conducting an investigation into his professional conduct, and his reputation in the community was in ruins. But the most satisfying moment came during Laura's deposition, when my attorney played the full recording from the motel room. Laura sat in the conference room listening to herself discuss our daughters like pawns in a chess game, her face growing paler with each revelation. "Dr. Staples," my attorney said when the recording ended, "do you still maintain that you were acting in the best interests of your children?" Laura's attorney objected, but the damage was done. Everyone in that room had heard her true feelings about our family, and there was no way to explain it away. The custody evaluation was equally devastating for Laura. The court-appointed psychologist interviewed both of us, along with the girls, and concluded that I was the more stable and committed parent. Beth, in particular, made it clear that she felt safer and more secure with me. "Your Honor," the psychologist reported, "while both parents clearly love their children, Mr. Fairburn has demonstrated greater consistency, reliability, and emotional stability throughout this process. Mrs. Staples appears to be going through a significant personal crisis that has affected her judgment and priorities." The final hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in late October. I arrived at the courthouse with Tom Bradley, carrying a briefcase full of evidence that would seal Laura's fate. She sat across the courtroom with her legal team, looking smaller and more defeated than I'd ever seen her. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd been handling family court cases for 20 years, reviewed the evidence with obvious distaste. The recordings, the financial documents, the witness testimony. It all painted a picture of a woman who'd systematically betrayed her family's trust for her own selfish desires. "Mrs. Staples," the judge said finally, "I've rarely seen a case where one party has so thoroughly documented their own unfitness as a custodial parent. Your behavior has been not only morally reprehensible, but actively harmful to your children's emotional well-being." Laura started to respond, but her attorney placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Mr. Fairburn," the judge continued, "while I don't approve of some of the methods you used to gather evidence, I cannot argue with the results. You've demonstrated a level of commitment to your children's welfare that is both admirable and necessary under these circumstances." The final judgment exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. I was awarded full physical custody of both girls, with Laura receiving only supervised visitation every other weekend. The house and all marital assets were divided heavily in my favor, with Laura responsible for her own legal fees and half of the debt she'd accumulated during her affair. Most importantly, the judge included a provision that Laura could not relocate the children more than 50 miles from their current school district without court approval, effectively preventing her from starting over somewhere else with the girls. As we left the courthouse, Laura tried one last time to salvage something from the wreckage. "Jason, please. We can work something out privately. The girls need their mother." I stopped and looked at her, this woman who'd shared my life for 15 years and then tried to destroy it for another man. "The girls need a mother who puts their welfare above her own desires," I said. "When you're ready to be that person, we can talk. Until then, you'll see them according to the court's schedule." Laura's face crumpled, but I felt no satisfaction in her pain. The victory was complete, but it had come at a cost that would affect all of us for years to come. That evening, I sat with Beth and Janie in our living room, the same room where Laura had welcomed her lover while I was at work. The girls were processing the day's events in their own ways, Beth with quiet maturity, Janie with the resilience of childhood. Are you sad about Mom? Janie asked, curled up next to me on the couch. I'm sad about a lot of things, sweetheart, but I'm not sad that we're going to be together. Will she come visit us? Yes, she'll come visit. And maybe someday, when she's figured some things out, she can visit more often. Beth looked up from her book. Dad, are you going to be okay? The question caught me off guard. In all the months of planning and fighting and strategic maneuvering, I'd never stopped to consider what would happen after I won. I think so, honey. It might take some time, but I think we're all going to be okay. 6 months later, Laura moved to a small apartment across town and took a position at a clinic in the next county. She attended her supervised visits religiously, but the easy relationship she'd once had with the girls was gone. They were polite, but distant, old enough to understand that she'd chosen to break up their family for reasons they couldn't comprehend. Williams never returned to his medical practice. His wife took their children and moved back to her hometown in Ohio, leaving him alone in the house he'd once filled with laughter. The last I heard, he was working at an urgent care clinic in another state, starting over with nothing but his medical degree and the weight of his mistakes. As for me, I threw myself into rebuilding the life Laura had tried to destroy. My business grew stronger, my relationship with my daughters deepened, and slowly the anger that had sustained me through the worst of it began to fade. I never remarried. Not because I couldn't trust again, but because I'd learned something valuable about the difference between love and possession, between partnership and performance. Laura had loved the idea of me, the security and stability I represented, but she'd never truly known who I was beneath the surface. The house still holds memories of what we used to be, but it's also filled with new memories of what we've become. Beth is in high school now, a strong and confident young woman who's learned that actions have consequences and that integrity matters more than convenience. Janie is 10, still innocent enough to believe in happy endings, but wise enough to recognize them when they appear. Sometimes, late at night when the girls are asleep, I sit in my workshop and think about the man I used to be, trusting, naive, willing to believe the best about people even when the evidence suggested otherwise. That man is gone, replaced by someone harder and more cynical, but also more honest about human nature and the price of betrayal. Laura got exactly what she said she wanted: freedom from our marriage and the chance to start her real life. But she discovered too late that the life she'd been living wasn't a prison. It was a gift she'd thrown away for the illusion of something better. I never did get my revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't destroy her career or ruin her reputation in the community. I didn't need to. Laura destroyed herself through her own choices, her own lies, her own willingness to sacrifice everything real for something temporary. The truth was revenge enough. And as I sit here now, watching my daughters grow into remarkable young women, I realize that the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something better from the ashes of what came before. Laura thought she could burn down our life and walk away unscathed. Instead, she discovered that some fires consume everything in their path, including the person who lit the match.